Hello and welcome to World Talks here on TVP World with me, Ashim Kumar. Tonight on TVP World, we examine US foreign policy under President Trump amid heightened tensions in Greenland, new sanctions on Russia, and the unprecedented plan to withdraw from 66 international organizations. Trump's calls for a massive military budget increase and his assertive Arctic ambitions have sparked concern among allies and lawmakers alike. Joining us is Brent Sadler, a senior fellow at the Heritage Foundation, to analyse the implications for US security, Europe and global governance. Brent, welcome back. Good to see you. And a Happy New Year, by the way.
Good to see you as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So let's start with Greenland. Some quite kind of aggressive, belligerent language coming from the White House about Greenland. It sounds, that Trump wants it to be a part of America, whichever way it needs to be done. Is that your understanding of what he's saying?
I think the history is a little important to kind of lay out. And I'd say the rhetoric also coming from Europe is in many ways equally unhelpful and certainly not de-escalatory. But I think the real intent here, to kind of go back in time, if you go back to 2000, early 2000 teens, like 2012 and 13 timeframe, Denmark had been welcoming a lot of Chinese investment in mining interests specifically without a lot of due diligence on screening or assuring that security interests were being addressed. There are several bases in Greenland, and Greenland does play a very vital role in missile defense, not just to the United States, but also through NORAD for Canada and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. So Greenland is a strategic value. Denmark wasn't taking DC's interest. Mind you, that was back in Obama timeframe with regards to China's presence in Greenland. And then, of course, by 2014 on, agreements to improve and increase defense spending to 2%, a NATO obligation from that point in 2014 on. Denmark only met that last year. And so Denmark has been unable and willing to spend its fair share and also ensure adequate security forces were present in Greenland also. So, of course, the United States, with very sharp national security interest in Greenland, and going back to Trump's first term, made very clear the continued status quo was unacceptable. And the Greenlanders themselves have also, at about the same time, have been increasing their calls for more sovereignty and more a portion of the pie of the natural resources there, which brings us to the situation today. Tensions with China, the war again in Europe with Russia invading Ukraine in 2022, tensions all across the Middle East as well in the last year or two, which hopefully we're turning a corner on, make it a very dangerous world. And taking such risk as a Chinese presence next to missile defense bases and sensors, unacceptable. But Denmark's been making a change. And so I think the pressure is to continue pushing Denmark to do more in defense, scrutinize Chinese presence in Denmark.
So if I understand you correctly, Brent, what you're saying is if Denmark pulls its socks up, there really isn't a question of a US invasion, for example, because anyway, America is free to place bases anywhere they like in Greenland, and they have been for a long, long time. So is that where you think we're going to end up?
Oh, I think that's like the lion's share of it. And to be clear, the U.S. doesn't have the carte blanche, the ability to just set up bases inside Greenland. Of course, the Danish government and increasingly the Danish government's giving more voice to the local government of the Greenlanders. And the United States respects both. That's been longstanding U.S. policy, and that was also reaffirmed by Trump in his first administration. I think he's signaling much the same, has not changed in his second term. So the United States isn't going to put a base there. There's no indication any serious thinking person puts towards a U.S. invasion of Greenland either.
Okay, let's move on now to what President Trump wants for the defense budget for 2027. He's looking for $1.5 trillion, which is quite a lot more than the $901 billion that Congress is budgeting for. What's going on there? Is this a negotiating technique, to get the number up to at least $1 trillion, or what's this big jump for?
Well, there's a couple of things at play here. First and foremost, the United States has not done due diligence in taking care of its own defense spending and infrastructure for far too long. And so it needs to make up for decades of neglect, especially since nations like China have been spending massive amounts and rapidly modernizing and expanding their military threat to the United States. The other part of this is the United States has gotten NATO to agree to spend 5% of GDP. And so it's also, I think it's becoming on the United States to spend a similar amount in its defense. And that, I think, is getting where you get closer to the $1.5 trillion. And again, we're making up for years, much like many of our NATO allies, years and years of neglecting the infrastructure and the industrial backbone for a meaningful defense. And certainly in this very dangerous world, it's a task we're coming to far too late.
Do you think Congress has the stomach for it, Brent? Do you think that 1.5 is going to get passed?
I think so. Even during the President Biden's administration, Congress pushed back numerous times on reduced or small defense budgets proposed by the president at the time. That's not something that I had witnessed in living memory in the United States until 2021, 2022 timeframe. So Congress is in the spending mood when it comes to national defense because the consensus in D.C. is China is a threat, and China is a massive threat.
OK, now, in the short time we have left, there are a couple of other areas I want to touch on. Senator Lindsey Graham has got the green light from President Trump to present a bipartisan sanctions bill against Russia. How likely is a vote on that bill when is that likely to happen?
I think a lot of this is a signaling intent of Congress more than actual having any meaningful, because it's early days. And certainly I don't think President Trump is going to approve anything that would constrain the powers of the executive, certainly not on these topics. So I think more of a testament of the spirit or the intent of Congress. And as this bill moves forward, it'll be an indication of who and how many Congress members actually support putting such constraints on the president's actions.
Yes, but I mean, he's talking about secondary sanctions here, so against countries like India and China, which actually does have teeth, doesn't it? Because, there have been voices, especially in Europe, which have said that President Trump has treated Putin with kid gloves so far. Do you see a shift in Trump's approach to Putin and the Russian war, the Russian invasion of Ukraine?
Yes, I would say it's been noted, I'd say, in the end of the summer timeframe, so like the end of August and September, the frustrations with President Putin and the failed second meeting that would have occurred back in the fall, perhaps in Hungary, that was canceled, is emblematic of this change of that tack with Moscow and frustration. So yes, secondary sanctions, I think China's top of that list. India also for its continued purchases of Russian petroleum and crude, much of it on the black market. But really, until there's significant pressures also on the battlefield, it's going to be hard to see if Putin's going to change. But the most visible change recently in the last week or two of President Trump's attack or willingness to take more risk in pressuring Moscow, seizing the Dark Fleet ships, the most recent one, the Bella 1, recently renamed to Marinera in the North Atlantic.
Right, but do you think that pressure extend to the US actually donating some weaponry to Ukraine, like many European countries are, as well as selling it, of course?
Yeah, I think Europe's long since passed its ability to donate or give much more of its weaponry. Over the last few years, it's pretty much tapped out, and now they have to build up munitions and equipment with new procurement, and that takes time. And so much of what you've seen since Trump's come into office is European countries spend on U.S. munitions that are then delivered to Ukraine. And, it's can seem like a shell game, but what it is it's those countries in Europe providing not just bundles of cash, but actually buying the weapons that go to Ukraine, as the United States continues to be the largest supplier and provider of weapons to Ukraine.
Do you think that these secondary sanctions and hopefully additional weaponry going to Ukraine are going to bring Putin to the negotiating table, and hopefully, before that, getting him to stop killing civilians?
Well, if Moscow's getting the message, this current crisis right now, if you could call it that, or certainly incident, which is the seizure of the Marinera or the Bella 1 ship in the North Atlantic, if Moscow is taking the message the right way, that's a signal that D.C. is willing to take a lot more risk in its bilateral relations with Russia in the pursuit of perhaps a ceasefire that's acceptable to D.C. and all parties, quite frankly, in Ukraine. If they don't take that message, then yes, secondary sanctions have to go forward on China as well as India. And I think you're going to have to see delivery of new weapons, the long-range strike weapons like Tomahawks that got Putin's attention earlier in the summer, will have to go forward as well.
Understood. Now, in the last minute or so that we have left, Brent, President Trump is withdrawing America from about 66 organizations, about half of which are in our United Nations organizations, the other NGOs and various other entities. What do you think is driving all of those withdrawals?
Oh, well, when President Trump came in, was elected on a mantra of like America first. And far too many of these international, multinational organizations the United States have been supporting with a very large amounts of money were organizations that were working directly against U.S. interest across the world. And so it just didn't make any sense. So common sense is one. The other is a lot of the social issues and programs, many of the sexual related type 1, sexual orientation or transgender, were much more alienating in countries that we wanted to partner with. And so it didn't make diplomatic sense to be pushing in an agenda that was also extremely alienating and making it harder to work towards U.S. interest. And then finally, this is a very critical point for many in D.C., the DOGE efforts also uncovered pretty much an open secret that a lot of this money was going to support domestic political interest groups more than what the top of the line of the issue was. And that includes money going to UN organizations as well. So cutting off the money to a lot of this just made a lot of common sense and certainly refocused U.S. limited resources where it matters most.
Understood. Brent Sadler, unfortunately, we're going to have to end it there, but thanks as always for coming along and sharing your insights with our audience. Have a good day.
You as well. Cheers.
Thanks. And that brings us to the end of this episode of World Talks. Don't go away, lots more coming up. Goodbye.